It was another miserable, hot, and humid day on CISO-4. The alien jungle was alive with the sounds of strange creatures, making dozens of different noises and producing hundreds of new smells. It might have been almost pleasant if they weren't patrolling for VID holdouts left behind when Alliance forces liberated the planet. Who knew how many of those bastards were still running around loose? The dense flora and rugged terrain made hiking through the jungle bad enough without worrying about VID beams or blades appearing out of the foliage. That is how the 30 Marines of 3rd Platoon, Sierra Company, 1st Battalion of the 9th Terran Marines, found themselves on this nature hike, or more precisely, 29 Marines and a fleet corpsman. Like the corpsmen and medics of the past, Petty Officer First Class Jacob Hahn was simply called Document. He had been a corpsman for 5 years, almost all with 3rd Platoon, and had been to hell and back with them. He knew every member of the 3rd Platoon by name, and would rush into the fire to get them out. Up ahead was a clearing of knee-high grasses, the perfect spot for an ambush, and the reason the patrol was waiting in the brush while a pair of Marines checked it out. They had just reached the center of the clearing when purple bolts from VID energy weapons flew out from the opposite tree line. The pair in the middle went down in the first volley. Someone shouted, "Contact, 300 meters. Return fire." The lieutenant yelled, the sound of Terran rifles echoing off every surface. "Sergeant Jenkins, take 1st squad and move left. Corporal Marks, 3rd squad to the right, and 2nd hold the center with me." The lieutenant shouted to his subordinates, "Garcia, get that railgun set up and suppress that tree line." The lieutenant was so busy setting up a defense that he didn't notice Doc crouched over as he ran to the 2 fallen Marines. After a few bolts got a little close, he dove to the ground, the grass hiding him from the VID, and crawled on his belly until he reached his buddies. One of them was ominously still, and rolling him over showed a smoking hole in the center of his chest. The second was moaning, having taken a hit to the left arm, another to the hip, and was bleeding from the head. Doc reached into his med bag and pulled out a little canister of expanding medical foam used to treat wounds from energy weapons. The majority of energy weapon hits would cauterize the tissue of the wound. The foam helped cool the wound and cover it to keep foreign objects out and suppress any bleeding that rough handling might trigger. It also provided pain relief directly to the severed nerve endings. "Ty," he spoke calmly, like this was a training exercise. "Can you hear me, buddy? It's Document." Ty made a noise that might have been an affirmative. Examination determined he had a concussion, so Doc quickly and efficiently bandaged his head and strapped his helmet back on him. Doc packed up his gear and reached down to a pocket on his left calf. Out came a coil of strong cord he carried for various uses. He took an end, ran it through the shoulder straps of the dead Marine's armor, and attached the coil to one of the handful of carabiners on his own armor. Putting his face close to Ty's, he said, "I need you to get on my back, and I'll get you back with the others." It was a struggle, but Ty managed to climb onto Doc's prone form. Even if the grass hid them from both sides, it didn't mean stray shots from either side couldn't hit them. Getting to his buddies felt like days, but took maybe 15 minutes. As soon as he got to their lines, a couple of Marines took Ty off his back and carried him to a spot in the rear. The lieutenant came at a crouching run. "God damn it, Doc, you're killing me," he yelled into Doc's ear to speak over the sound of combat. "We need you here, and every time you do that, it takes years off my life. We set up a spot for you in the rear. Now get your ass back there," the lieutenant said before smiling. "Nice work on getting Ty back." "Aye, sir." "Thank you, sir," Doc replied. Removing what part of the cord hadn't spooled out behind him, he handed it to the lieutenant. At the questioning look, he explained, "Cruz didn't make it, but I attached this to his armor. We can pull him out from here." The lieutenant gave a quick nod of understanding and yelled for a couple of his squad to start reeling Cruz in. Marines left no one behind except as a last resort. Doc made his way back to the wounded and was glad to find only 2 other patients there. Both had minor wounds that just needed dressing. But first, he needed to finish stabilizing Ty within 4 and getting him strapped into an evac litter. He got out a bag of saline, tubing, and a catheter. "Hold this," he told one of the walking wounded, handing him the saline. With a sense of urgency, Dr. Marshall tore open the package for the 4 tubing, set it up, and grabbed the 4 needle. After tying a small tourniquet around Ty's bicep, he felt for the vein in his elbow. Once he located it, he inserted the needle, checked for good placement, and then removed the needle, leaving the catheter in the vein. He attached the tubing to the catheter, taped everything down securely, and set the flow rate. Satisfied with his work, he turned his attention to the other wounded, quickly dressing their wounds so they could continue fighting if necessary. He kept them close to provide some security and assist with moving less mobile cases. A call came from the right flank, "Calman up." Without hesitation, Marshall headed to 3rd Squad, where Sergeant Kyle met him. "I got 2 down from a grenade. We got them behind that rock," Kyle said, pointing. "I got it," Marshall replied, moving towards the wounded. "Thanks, Doc," Kyle shouted as he returned to the line. Behind the rock, Marshall found 2 Marines, Rodriguez and Garcia, trying to keep pressure on the worst wounds. "Good work, just like I showed you. Keep holding pressure," Marshall instructed. He assessed the first Marine, noting dozens of shrapnel holes where the armor was pierced. The breastplate inspection showed small holes from shrapnel. Most wounds just needed dressing and securing, but 3 were actively bleeding. Marshall set Rodriguez to bandaging the simpler wounds and focused on the bleeders himself. The second Marine had taken the brunt of the explosion. His torso was a mess, with parts of his armor driven into the wound. This required more time. Marshall returned to the first patient, cleaned the wounds, sprayed clotting foam, and stapled the wounds closed. "That should hold for now. Bandage them up and get her ready for transport," he told Rodriguez. He then turned to Garcia. "Bandage these small wounds. I'll have something else for you soon." Before continuing, he radioed the lieutenant. "I need immediate dust off. I have a priority case that needs immediate surgery." The lieutenant responded, "I'll see what I can do." Status of injured? Marshall was working on the second patient. "1 priority. I think it's Davidson, but he's a mess. 2 urgent, Young and Ty. 2 walking wounded, Sean and Bell. I left them to watch over Ty. I'm sending Young back with Garcia and Rodriguez to help move Davidson. 1 Kia, but I didn't get a chance to identify." "Understood," the lieutenant replied. Marshall continued working on Davidson, inserting in 4 and intubating him. He sent Rodriguez and Garcia to move Young to the rear and worked quickly to secure the bleeders by cauterizing or suturing them. Just as he finished getting Davidson as ready to be moved as possible, the 2 Marines returned. They loaded Davidson onto a stretcher and started moving when another call rang out, "Calman up." Fortunately, the firing had begun to die down, and Marshall reached 1st Squad without trouble. Among the 3 injured Marines, the worst was a broken leg from a fallen tree, while the other 2 had simple energy weapon burns. What frustrated Marshall the most were the 2 still forms on the line. He directed the 2 walking wounded to take the 3rd Marine back to the others. Engrossed in his work, he hadn't noticed the absence of weapon fire. The battlefield was now filled only with the dead or dying, and Marines were securing the area, leaving a pair of prisoners. Seeing no more wounded, Marshall hurried back to his aid station to check on his patients. Most were stable, but Davidson was crashing. Using every trick he knew to keep Davidson's heart beating, he radioed, "Lieutenant, I need that dust off, or I'm going to lose Davidson." "ETA 2 minutes, the lieutenant replied. The next 2 minutes felt like an eternity. The chunks of breastplate in Davidson's wound made it difficult to access his heart and lungs. Marshall sighed with relief when the assault ship landed in the clearing. He grabbed the nearest healthy Marines and carried Davidson to the ship, sending any Marine he encountered back to evacuate the other wounded. He worked with the medics to get Davidson into the trauma bed and hooked up to the medical systems. Once he was sure all his wounded and the dead were loaded on the ship, he could finally take a moment to breathe. Lucas took a moment to sit on a rock and watch the captured prisoners being secured in the ship. Lieutenant Harper approached Lucas and said, "We're marching back to base, but you look exhausted. Why don't you catch a ride back with our wounded?" Lucas stood up and started walking towards the ship. "Let me restock my medkit, and I'll be ready to join you," he replied. Lieutenant Harper shook his head, worried about Lucas, but also damn glad to have him with them. The diminished platoon finally reached the base 6 hours later. Despite the near-legendary fitness of Terran Marines, they were dragging their feet as they passed through the gates. As Sergeant Jansen would later say, they couldn't whip a pair of Delian cubs at that point. The arrival of 2 companies from the Crani-Allen Empire allowed the 3rd Platoon to take a 24-hour rest. This was enough to perk up most of the Marines, who then headed into the adjacent settlement where they built the base to take in refugees without compromising base security. The Crani-aliens were one of the most recent and arrogant species to join the Galactic Confederation, and they still thought humans were a joke. Like most species, they assumed all humans were like the traders, mechanics, and shopkeepers that could be found throughout Confederation space. So when 10 of them entered a Lacan-owned bar that contained a handful of Marines and Lucas sitting alone in the corner, they didn't show any respect. They mistook Lucas sitting alone as easy prey to humiliate, unaware that he always took his first drink alone to decompress from a mission before joining his buddies. As the Crani-aliens confidently strutted over to Lucas' table, the bartender let the Marines know what was happening. One of the Crani-aliens leaned in and said, "Get out of our spot, tiny human, or I will crush you like an egg." The bartender sent his son away and waved the 2 Idri logistic workers to join him at the far end of the bar. As the Crani-alien continued to harass Lucas, a whistle from behind made them turn around to find 6 Marines standing there, looking very angry. Seeing he outnumbered the Marines, the Crani-alien sneered, "Go away, puny humans, or you'll get hurt." In his arrogance, he expected the humans to flee, so he was surprised when they spread out and moved forward. The Crani-aliens were smug as they turned to face the Marines, but the look on their faces changed to fear as more and more Marines began entering the bar. Over 24 more Marines entered the bar, with the bartender's son behind them. Humans, especially Marines, were extremely popular with the Lacan locals, so the bartender didn't think twice about sending his son to find more Marines. The Crani-aliens found themselves surrounded by almost 30 pissed-off Marines, less than half from the 3rd Platoon. The bartender looked at the 2 Idri and said, "A piece of advice." He was interrupted by the sound of the Crani-alien cries of pain as the Marines began to beat them mercilessly. "Never mess with the Marines' corpsmen," he finished.